morning, everybody, and welcome to the AM Report for HAPS News, the network of now. I'm Alex Mahajer. I'm your host, and it is Wednesday, December 9th. This morning on the program, I'll be joined by investigative journalist Greg Palast to discuss his work that uncovered 198,000 wrongfully purged voters in Georgia ahead of the January 5th runoff election in the Georgia Senate race. We're going to be talking about that and covering all of today's top headlines, all of this and more on the AM Report. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the program. I'm Alex Mahajer. If you're watching on the HAPS app, website, or platform, please click the award button and let us know you're enjoying it. Let us know you're enjoying it on the HAPS app, website, or platform. Click the award button, let us know. Or if you're watching on Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, YouTube, Periscope, wherever you may be watching, leave us a comment. Let us know you're enjoying it and bat around with us so we can let you know what we're thinking. We've got a lot of headlines to cover this morning. Before we get into our conversation with Greg Palast, he's an investigative journalist. He's been all over the place, Rolling Stone, books, done a couple documentaries. Very, very knowledgeable guy with a specific eye towards voter suppression. Very grateful to have him again. He's been on the program before. But first, today's headlines. President-elect Joe Biden has promised at least 100 million COVID vaccine shots into the arms of the American people in his first 100 days in office. He also pledged to make masks mandatory on trains and planes engaged in interstate travel and in federal buildings. In one sentence, the United States Supreme Court rejected an attempt by the Pennsylvania Republicans to overturn the state's election results. Pretty striking, especially with the new 6-3 conservative majority on the court. Senator Pat Toomey, a Republican in Pennsylvania, also chimed in to call President Trump's efforts to overturn the election, quote, completely unacceptable. President-elect Biden will nominate Ohio Congresswoman Marcia Fudge to the Department of Housing and Urban Development and Tom Vilsack to lead the Department of Agriculture. I will note that Tom Vilsack led the Department of Agriculture under President Obama, so he will be back again to talk to lead the department. So all in all, the appointments are coming together. I'd like to say good morning to Daniel Goffalo. Daniel, good to see you. He's saying we need a stimulus check from the government. Food insecurity is a real major problem. Start a quote hashtag meal train in your community. Mary O'Brien is saying she loves it and we love you. Thank you so much for joining. So I'd like to now play for you my conversation with investigative journalist Greg Palast and to talk about the work that he has been doing in Georgia ahead of this runoff to expose voter suppression efforts in that state. Here's my conversation with Greg Palast. I'd like to welcome investigative journalist and author Greg Palast to the program. Greg has been doing a lot of investigative journalism, particularly with regards to voter suppression for many, many years. He's written for Rolling Stone and he's written books and done documentaries, and he's with us now. Please welcome Greg Palast to the program. Good morning, Greg.
Glad to be with you, Alex.
Greg, you have been at the front lines of exposing voter suppression efforts, particularly in Georgia over the last few years. We've talked a couple different times, and I'm really happy to have you back just a day before this lawsuit is going to have its first hearing with regards to a preliminary injunction that you filed to reinstate 198,000 Georgia voters back to the voter rolls after it turns out through your investigative work at the Greg Palast Investigative Fund that they've been purged wrongfully. Will you explain a little bit about what has happened here and what remedy you're seeking through the courts?
Okay, so back in September, the Palast Investigative Fund, which is my team of experts, we have about 15 people, usually read my stuff in papers, Guardian, you see me on BBC, on Democracy Now!, Rolling Stone. But this time we did a report which we gave to the ACLU of Georgia, which issued our finding, quite elaborate, that exactly 198,351 voters were wrongly removed from the voter rolls. They call it the purge, or nice people call it list maintenance. That's what the GOP functionaries call it. Now, these voters were removed by the state of Georgia Republican functionary named Brian Raffensperger, who had taken the place of his prior Purgeon general, a guy named Brian Kemp, the governor. Now, Kemp, when he ran for governor in 2018, ran against Stacey Abrams, and he had removed at that time 340,000 voters illegally, wrongly. Now, what am I talking about? I was working for Salon. We hired experts. What they said was, these people have moved. Okay, if you don't live in Georgia, you don't live in Atlanta, you can't vote in Atlanta, can you? It's against the law. You go to prison. Now, how many of these 340,000 illegally registered people were voted illegally? Zero. But were they actually illegal voters? Did they really move and try to attempt to vote in Georgia? No. I was at the polling stations. You'll see at the cover of my ACLU report that
I'd like to welcome investigative journalist and author Greg Palast to the program. Greg has been doing a lot of investigative journalism, particularly with regards to voter suppression for many, many years. He's written for Rolling Stone and he's written books and done documentaries, and he's with us now. Please welcome Greg Palast to the program. Good morning, Greg.
Glad to be with you, Alex.
Greg, you have been at the front lines of exposing voter suppression efforts, particularly in Georgia over the last few years. We've talked a couple different times, and I'm really happy to have you back just a day before this lawsuit is going to have its first hearing with regards to a preliminary injunction that you filed to reinstate 198,000 Georgia voters back to the voter rolls after, it turns out, through your investigative work at the Greg Palast Investigative Fund, that they've been purged wrongfully. Will you explain a little bit about what has happened here and what remedy you're seeking through the courts?
Okay, so back in September, the Palast Investigative Fund, which is my team of experts, we have about 15 people, usually read my stuff in papers, Guardian, you see me on BBC, on Democracy Now!, Rolling Stone. But this time we did a report which we gave to the ACLU of Georgia, which issued our finding, quite elaborate, that exactly 198,351 voters were wrongly removed from the voter rolls. They call it the purge, or nice people call it list maintenance. That's what the GOP functionaries call it. Now, these voters were removed by the state of Georgia Republican functionary named Brian Raffensperger, who had taken the place of his prior Purgeon general, a guy named Brian Kemp, the governor. Now, Kemp, when he ran for governor in 2018, ran against Stacey Abrams, and he had removed at that time 340,000 voters illegally, wrongly. Now, what am I talking about? I was working for Salon. We hired experts. What they said was, these people have moved. Okay, if you don't live in Georgia, you don't live in Atlanta, you can't vote in Atlanta, can you? It's against the law. You go to prison. Now, how many of these 340,000 illegally registered people were voted illegally? Zero. But were they actually illegal voters? Did they really move and try to attempt to vote in Georgia? No. I was at the polling stations. You'll see at the cover of my ACLU report that that Christine Jordan, 92 years old, I was there when she was thrown out, her granddaughter in hysterics, when she's thrown out of the polls. They said, you're not registered here anymore. You can't vote here. And we looked it up. They said, because she had moved. What do you mean she'd moved? So I went to the house that she supposedly moved out of, and there's a picture of Martin Luther King on the wall. And I said, you knew Dr. King? She says, that's my cousin. It's a picture of her having dinner at that house 60 years ago. So obviously she hadn't moved in 60 years, but they took away her vote. Her real crime was voting while black. Same with 1/3 people, overwhelmingly young voters and voters of color. And now they've repeated this trick. We caught them. They claim to change the law to make it fairer, but they didn't. Yeah, they made it, instead of removing 1/3 voters, they removed just about 200,000 voters illegally, again, saying that they've moved.
And Greg, this is important because, as we know, Georgia, for the first time since 1992, went for the Democratic candidate in the presidential election by 12,000 votes. There were 3 recounts. All 3 of them came to the same conclusion, that Joe Biden is the president, was elected in that state. And so this is a state where 12,000 votes makes a difference. maybe just a handful of votes could make a difference, let alone 198,000. And
Right.
these purges are specifically targeted towards people of color, and your work has exposed us in the past, and we're very grateful
Yes.
for your work.
Well, in fact, yes. And so just so to understand, you asked me about what will happen in the courtroom tomorrow, Thursday. This is a federal court. And this lawsuit, I'm just an expert in the case that came up, one of the experts that came up with the report from the ACLU, which is being cited. The lawsuit is being brought by Georgia voters. Black Voters Matter, by the Transformative Justice Coalition. That's, if you don't know it, that's actually Barbara Arnwine, is the great Columbia Law School professor, top voting rights lawyer in America. We have the National Bar Association, which is the African American Bar Association, which is headed out of Atlanta with C.K. Hoffler. And we have the Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project, SVREP. They are the big frontline grassroots Hispanic organization, which there's a heck of a lot of people named Diaz on there. In fact, we spoke to Mr. Diaz, who was on that list, who lost his vote because they said he moved. He says, I haven't moved in 20 years. We got him on camera. We've got a lot of voters saying, I didn't move. I don't know where they got this stuff. So we checked. And so we're going to hold this hearing tomorrow demanding injunctive relief, saying you got to put these people right back now. And by the way, the reason we know that their list is phony is we hired the experts. Now, the number one expert on whether you've moved or not is called the United States Postal Service. And federal law required the state to check with the Postal Service. You can't remove someone from moving unless it's verified that they've moved. First, you have to ask the post office, and you must do so with a licensee. The post office you can actually hire through their licensees. They only have about 18. We hired 2 licensees, and the state said it hired a licensee, but guess what? They didn't. We caught them red-handed. They used some guy who lives on a golf course in Omaha who came up with this list of moved voters, and they didn't move nowhere. They never put in those change of address forms. It's a complete phony. It's a fabrication. It's a fraud. It's a lie. It's racist Jim Crow junk. And I know that doesn't sound very expert, but that's exactly my expert conclusion.
Well,
you remove someone who hasn't moved, it's fraudulent. It's no good. It's racist. And it's the worst of Jim Crow tactics. 200,000 voters. So we're demanding that they be put back right now. They were removed illegally. Put them back before this runoff.
Right, and we'll be watching what happens in this hearing tomorrow. And unfortunately, the deadline to register in the January 5th runoff Senate election in Georgia has now passed. So this really is going to be the only avenue by which Georgia voters who have been wrongfully purged will have some sort of relief and be able to cast their vote. And in this case, the entire future of the United States Senate and potentially the entire beginning years of Joe Biden's presidency in terms of what he's able to accomplish in terms of his agenda will all hinge on these 2 Senate races. So it's very important what happens in Georgia, but also for democracy's sake. So,
that by the way, that's important. This isn't about Democrats or Republicans. So obviously, which party controls the U.S. Senate is at stake. It's high stakes. But for me, I didn't look at voter registrations. I'm trying to put on everyone, whether they're black, white, Republican, Democrat, Green Party. I don't care. I'm not here for partisan purpose. But I should say, are you ready for this? The Republican National Committee has zoomed in from Washington to demand to be allowed in the case to argue against this. So I guess that they assume that remove Democrats because they don't want them back on the voter rolls. Why does the Republican Party want to be in this case? And why are they against having voters wrongly removed from the voter rolls? Why are they against returning them to the voter rolls? This isn't a partisan issue. I don't even know why they're there, except that they're scared that their Jim Crow tactic will be reversed. And not only that, if we beat them in Georgia, which is, of course, because the Senate is on the line, is huge itself. Right. But it's also true that this could stop similar vote suppression tactics being used in other states from Michigan, Ohio, North Carolina, and beyond.
Right. I think the reason I wanted to bring up the political ideologies involved here is not to say that only Democratic voters should be looked out here for, but that there might be some political impetus for these purges to occur at
Absolutely.
all. And it looks like Georgia, being a state that's trending blue, has very powerful vested interests who would like to keep minority rule over the majority. And this is a tactic that you've exposed many, many times. In the past, they would take names, as I understand it, they would take names that had differing middle initials and even different birthdays on the registration and purge them, claiming that these voters had moved out of state, and now they're at it again.
Yeah. You know, like, yeah, if you look at my book, How Trump Stole 2020, and my other reports that I did for Rolling Stone, we did a story exposing a system used in Georgia called Crosscheck, in which they look for people who've moved to other states. Well, if you move, like I said, you move, you shouldn't vote in Georgia. But who moved? According to the hit list, which we got from the Secretary of State after we sued, by the way, we sued successfully the Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, and then his successor. They have 538 guys named James Brown that they said left the state because, believe it or not, they found James Brown Detroit, James Brown Baltimore. Now, it doesn't matter to them that these James Browns, almost none of them had the same middle name, though some did. They were marked junior and senior. I kid you not. And they were removing these voters from the voter rolls, not only in Georgia, but then they removed the voter in Michigan. They removed the voter in Maryland. They removed the voter in Ohio. So this is ugly Jim Crow tactics. And again, like, you know, the Republican, they must be majority Democrats, because why else would the Republican Party jump into this hearing unless they believe, you know, what, they were fighting me because I want to return Republicans to the voter rolls? I don't know the party affiliations, but they must. They must really know those are party affiliations, and they wanted those people off. They got them off, and they want them to stay off before this runoff for the 2 Senate seats. The final day of voting is January 5. By the way, even though, and again, you're right, if we win the court case, the December 7th deadline doesn't count because we'll keep these voters back on. We've re-registered an awful lot. Go to gregpalast.com. You're going to see PSAs by Rosario Dawson, Zoe Saldana, and Deborah Messing, which were released, by the way, by Leonardo DiCaprio from his Instagram page. Why are we doing that? To warn voters to re-register. So we got literally tens of thousands of voters back on already, but that's not everyone. You can't reach everyone. People don't know they've been purged. They don't know that they've lost their vote until they, like Mrs. Jordan, show up and they're in tears.
So I want to ask you, Greg, because this is important. So a voter gets purged from the rolls. They don't know that they've been purged. They show up on election day to go cast their ballot. Their name isn't on the voter roll. They're told what? That either that they can't vote or that they can cast a provisional ballot. And then
yes, and one of the big problems you run into is that most people, in fact, every person that says that's been told you can't vote because you're no longer registered here, you have this weird federal law which says that they must be offered a provisional ballot. That's not a good idea because that ballot will not be counted. No one, if you're not registered, you can't vote, and you can fill out all the ballots you want. So the provisional ballot, the problem is that people think, oh, well, I guess I got to vote because I filled out this ballot. You fill it out, you put it in an envelope, you put your information on the outside. If they say you're not registered, you're not registered, whether it was fair or unfair, and they throw out the vote. The problem is a lot of people went in, filled out provisional ballots, and think that they're now registered. Oh, it was okay. I just filled out this ballot. No, they didn't count that ballot. We had, I know, at least 50,000 provisional ballots were junked, and a lot of mail-in votes were junked in Georgia on November 3rd. That's why it was only 12,000 votes for Biden. Understand, look at the polls and the exit polls. Biden walked away with Georgia. He didn't win by a few votes. Yeah, they're saying, oh, he won by like 0.1%. No way. You look at those polls. What happened is all those provisional ballots that were disqualified and all the mail-in ballots that were disqualified indicate that Biden won by a bigger margin. Now, again, it's not whether you believe Biden should be president or Trump or his mommy. That's not the point. The point is that votes should be counted. And we have the problem that people think that they voted because they got those placebo ballots. We call them provisional ballots. I call them placebo ballots because you think you voted, but you didn't.
Right. And, I'll note, Greg, in 2016, Hillary Clinton, I'll note exit polls are the gold standard around the world for the way an election is going to go. In 2016, Hillary Clinton was showed to be winning in many, many exit polls in various states that she went on to lose in computerized vote tallies. And that's because, like you said, people were casting these provisional ballots. They had been purged from the voter rolls. And then the computerized results showed something different.
And they don't count if they throw away your ballot. Look, you go to an exit poll, so you leave the poll, like in 16, and they ask you who you voted for. Well, you know who you voted for. You voted for Hillary Clinton or whatever, Trump, whatever. What you don't know is if your vote counted. I've never heard an exit pollster ask a voter, did you get a provisional ballot? Did you get a conditional ballot? Or do you know if your vote counted? Now, this is interesting. Like, take the case of Michigan. In 2016, Trump supposedly won Michigan, or officially won Michigan, by 10,700 votes out of 5 million. That's it. 10,000 votes out of 5 million. What you don't see, except they had it in the local papers, and I had it on Democracy Now!, but what you didn't hear in most press is that 75,355 ballots were never counted, almost all of those in Detroit. Now, you tell me whose votes those are. And the reason they weren't counted is that 87 tallying machines broke down. They just broke down, so they didn't count the votes. They just broke down. And so, but if they broke down in Flint, they broke down in Detroit, poor areas that warned the state, we have bad machines. You've got to give us new machines. They wouldn't do, the Republicans controlling the state at the time wouldn't give them new machines. So the ballots didn't get counted in Detroit. So Trump, if you counted those ballots, Trump didn't win Michigan. He didn't win the presidency. So we have a bad habit in the United States. We don't count all the votes. This is a big, big problem that we're not facing. And we think it's just cool. It's all right to challenge our opponent's votes. And I'm not going to say that the Democrats are innocent of this either. But right now, it happens to be the Republicans seem to be the Purges champs. And mainly because it affects voters of color who tend to vote Democratic. So they have a reason. There's a reason why the Republican Party is in there. They don't want these voters back, especially if they're voters of color, young people. It's not their voters. They're going to try to block it.
Very good, Greg. We know you're really busy. Thank you so much for joining. Where can people support your work and the Palast Investigative Fund?
Well, as long as you're opening up to, yes, we do have tax-deductible donations. We're nonpartisan, not-for-profit, tax-deductible Palast Investigative Fund. But what I really want you to do, truly, whether you donate or not, I want you to go to gregpalast.com, GREGPALAST.com, to get the continuing reports. Pass on, if you know anyone in Georgia, pass on our reports and our public service broadcasts by Rosario Dawson and others. And I look forward to continuing to give you updates, Alex. I love your show. You're really informative. You're right on point. And I'll see you soon and tell you what happens.
All right, Greg.
In that court case.
Thank you so much. This has been Greg Palast, investigative journalist, author, and saver of the world. Thank you, Greg, and we'll talk to you soon.
You're welcome.